What I'm going to talk about is moral virtue and glory, because I think that a great mistake about how we deal with things like jihadis or terrorists is the idea that they're nihilists. And nihilism is usually willful blindness to the moral framework of your adversary. And I want to argue that the people who commit themselves to the jihad are deeply moral human beings, like most of us. And in fact, they buy into moral virtue. And I think it is moral virtue which basically got human beings, which are very weak-bodied primates, out of the caves and made them the dominant species on Earth, and was responsible for the creation of civilizations and wars. And jihadism is in the same line of, I think, all the isms of modern times: anarchism, communism, socialism, democratic liberalism, all of which I think are secular variants of monotheism. Monotheism was basically the first time in human history. I'm an anthropologist, I work with tribes all over the world, but monotheism created this concept of humanity and the idea of saving it. And all the ideological systems we live in today are salvational, messianic systems, believing that they have the message for humanity and save them. Jihadism is one of them. It is a particularly violent strand, but there have been others much worse in our century. And it's very similar, in fact, to the anarchist strain of about 100 years ago. And much of the reaction of the world to the jihadi phenomena is very similar to the reaction of the world to the anarchist phenomena of 100 years ago, which was actually more virulent and more dangerous, having killed an American president, the Tsar, sparked World War I with the assassination of the Archduke of Austria, and was also considered to be commanded and controlled by this sort of anarchist central organization, that there were cells all over the place, when in fact it was basically a bottom-up, self-organized, self-motivating group of young men and women who committed themselves to one another even more than to their cause. The origins of moral virtue, I think, can be, our understanding of it goes way back, but I think Darwin had some fundamental insights. You know, when he wrote The Origins of Species, he basically said human beings are just like all other creatures. They act in their own self-interest, whether in the short run or long run. But then the problem of bravery in group fighting puzzled him, and he tried to understand why brave people who have no real hope of success nevertheless are willing to sacrifice their lives. And he argued in The Descent of Man that human beings have something which I'll call moral virtue that makes them quite different than other animals and willing to sacrifice what nowadays we'd say for their non-relatives, their non-genetic relatives, for which there's no biological explanation per se. And of course, he wrote this to to Wallace, co-discoverer of evolution, who wrote back, yes, of course, just as in mathematics and as music, there is a divine inspiration to human beings. And Darwin said, well, please, he wrote a letter back, don't kill our child with this kind of thinking. But he was puzzled, and he never figured out where moral virtue came from. But I want to argue that the jihadis thoroughly buy into this notion of moral virtue. It's the kind of thing that R.V. Jones described when London was under the Blitz as a sort of white, blinding light that makes you bond with your fellow countrymen and be willing to sacrifice everything to make sure your nation or your community endures. Now, my aim isn't to relativize or to argue that the patriot, the rudest savage, and the jihadi are all the same, but to suggest that sacrificing life for God and group is not an exception in human history and cultural life, but a general canon by which groups form, vie for survival, and thrive. Within this framework, I try to deal not only with jihadis and terrorists, but with seemingly intractable conflicts, as between the Indians and the Pakistanis over Kashmir, or the Israelis and the Palestinians, or now between the Iranians and the Americans, in terms of what I call sacred values. Now, almost all our political thinking and our economic thinking works on notions of rational self-interest. There are variants of it, there's biases and heuristics, but it is mostly a utilitarian approach developed here in the United Kingdom by Bentham and Mill out of the writings of David Hume and others. But there is a different sort of tradition in thinking that argues that there are things human beings do regardless of any consequences or prospects of success, out of a noble or moral imperative. People on the continent like Emil Durkheim and before him Immanuel Kant believed that people do things because they ought to do it, again without regard to their consequences. So what I try to do is bring this insight into trying to figure out how we can solve seemingly intractable conflicts. Now, much more is known about economic decision-making than about moral decision-making. Very little is known about sacred values. And in negotiations, in political negotiations, which I'm deeply involved in sometimes, the standard view is you leave the hard questions of recognition and who you are for last, and you try to build things slowly through economics, small steps, and through person-to-person discussions. And I find that when sacred values are in conflict, that is a formula for another 100 years of war. Now, what do I mean by sacred values? Well, they're values that are very strongly tied to the emotions, to your sense of who you are within your community, and you're usually not even aware of them. It's a little bit like food. People usually aren't aware of the importance of food till they're starving. But when they're starving, it becomes asymptotic. It becomes the one value people have. Same with your sacred values. Sacred values are the frame within which all social and economic transactions are possible. And again, you're usually not even aware of them until some other society or some other group challenges them, and then they become dominant. Now, in our society, we don't have standard principles of sacred values anymore. In religious groups, we don't. But except for our children and perhaps our nation, everything is supposedly fungible. But of course, if I asked you, would you accept $1 million to sell off your child? You'd say I'm crazy. If I insisted on it, you'd think I'm sort of sociopath, right? But that's exactly the way people feel when one offers them a material incentive to exchange their sacred values. Now, what I've done is gone around the world in these seemingly intractable conflicts and try to find out what are the values that keep people in culture clashes. And then I try to figure out what would happen if they recognized one another's values. It's something as simple as that. This is just a study of martyrs' families, and we find that the more you offer a martyr's family compensation for their child becoming a martyr, the less likely they are to support martyrdom operations. So I went and I visited Mr. Mashal in Damascus, and I asked Mr. Netanyahu if he had any messages for Mr. Mashal. And the only message that Netanyahu had for Mashal was this: ask him if the Hamas would ever recognize our right to be here. That's the only question I'm interested in. Everything else is irrelevant for now. Once we get an answer to that, then we can talk. Then everything else is possible. Mr. Mashal's answer was, how can I recognize the rights of my jailer to be here when I'm still in jail? Let me free, and we can talk about it. Let them recognize what they have done to us. So after these kinds of discussions, we went out and did random surveys of Palestinian populations and random surveys of settlers just hours before they were evacuated from Gaza, thousands of people. And we offered them material trade-offs, peace trade-offs. You told me this was going to. We offered them trade-offs for peace, like in the Geneva Accords. Would you accept a peace treaty with the Palestinians, or the Israelis? There would be a Jewish state of Israel and a Palestinian state. But Palestinians would be required to give up their right of return. Palestinians said no, almost all Palestinians. Then I actually came with someone from the White House, who had just left the White House, with the leaders, and offered this material incentive. In return, the USA and the European Union would give Palestine $10 billion a year for 100 years. The idea was to make this credible. And among the leaders, as among the people, there was increased support for violence, less support for a deal, more support for suicide terrorism. The more material compensation was offered to accept the peace process. Then we offered a different alternative. On their part, and we pretested it to make sure that neither side believed that this was going to be accompanied by any material compensation whatsoever. On their part, Israel would apologize for their role in the dislocation and dispossession of Palestinians in 1947. An apology, which doesn't figure on any calculus of utility. Opposition to the peace deal declined significantly, even among hardcore radicals. Support for suicide terrorism and violence also declined significantly. We did this for the Israelis, Israeli settlers, and we got exactly the same results. This is just graphs, don't pay attention. This was published in Science magazine in the Proceedings of the National Academy back in 2007. And what we found among the Israeli settlers was if the Palestinians would simply recognize, I mean, the more money you offered them, the angrier they got, and the more willing they were to fight, and the more disgusted and violent they became, and viscerally. But if the Palestinians were willing simply to recognize their right to exist, why they came here, then their opposition, even to leaving and abandoning their homes, declined significantly, and especially to resorting to violence. Making these sorts of wholly intangible symbolic concessions, like an apology or recognition of a right to exist, or a simple but sincere show of respect, simply doesn't compute on any utilitarian calculus. Now, we've just done a survey in Iran of almost all Iranian provinces, randomized survey, and what we found was that a significant percentage of the population, 14%, believe acquiring a nuclear capability is now a sacred value. So sacred values don't just attach to things that have deep cultural traditions. Sacred values also attach to things that are very recent, but intricately bound with notions of national sovereignty, of community sovereignty and identity. And the more either rewards, either carrots or sticks were used to get people to give up their nuclear capability, the more entrenched they became in supporting it, and the more violent they were willing to come to defend it. By the way, we found this true among Iranians for acquiring nuclear energy, but not for nuclear weapons. Yet when we published these results initially, we said nuclear capability. Headlines across Newsweek and Wall Street Journal was, Iranians believe acquiring nukes sacred value. Believe what you want to believe. So what is this telling me? It's telling us that sacred values are values that defy the logic, the cost-benefit logic of realpolitik in the marketplace. And that we have to deal with these if we want to have any hope of trying to break through seemingly intractable conflicts. Now, I also want to argue that it's really sacred values that drive the jihadi phenomena, but of a very peculiar nature. First of all, most people who join the jihad have no religious education whatsoever to begin with. The overwhelming majority across the world are born again late in their teens or early 20s. In fact, religious education is a negative predictor of whether you will support violence or the jihad. The madrasas, except for the Taliban, which is a very localized phenomenon, and 30 out of about 50,000 in Indonesia have no role to play in this. Second misconception, where we've also done the research, humiliation is a negative predictor of willingness to participate in violence. People who are humiliated don't participate in violence. They tend to be submissive. Those who believe they're acting for others who are humiliated, that's something different. For example, second and third generation immigrants in the United Kingdom who believe their parents were humiliated or their people were humiliated. That can cause them to be violent. But again, humiliated people don't. And what we're seeing for the first time in human history, since the 1990s is a massive, media-driven global political awakening, where literally people who were cannibals 2 generations ago, and I'm talking about Borneo and Sulawesi, see exactly the same things as people in London or Paris or New York or Tierra del Fuego now on the internet and in the media. And so there's this huge amount of information out there, and people are plugging into very narrow bandwidths that they can make sense of. And one of these bandwidths is the jihad. I asked someone who was in prison in France who wanted to blow up the American embassy, why did you want to do this? He said, well, you know, I was walking down the street one day and someone spit at my sister and called her a salarab, and I just couldn't take it anymore. So I said, well, you know, that's been going on for years. He said, yeah, but the jihad didn't exist then. People talk about being brainwashed, recruiters, jihadi cells, Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda never recruited anybody. Al-Qaeda was like the National Center for Scientific Research or some research center here that takes grant proposals, about 15 to 20% of proposals that accepted. People go looking for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda doesn't really go looking for people. They put out messages. Let's take the example of Major Hassan, or the guy who blew up his fellow soldiers in Fort Hood, or Umar Abdul Muttalib, who was the Christmas Day bomber, would-be Christmas Day bomber last Christmas, or Mohammed Shahzad, who tried to blow up with firecrackers propane tanks in Times Square. The headlines across the world was Awlaki, this American-born, Yemeni-based imam, who these people had communicated with, had brainwashed these people into doing this. But if you look at the email messages, Hassan sends 24 emails to Awlaki. Awlaki sends 2 back. And the 2 are basically, you go in the right way of my son, go in the way of God. I mean, nothing operational or anything. They're not giving them that kind of guidance. They're basically out there saying, we're here for you. Now you go, you self-organize, you self-motivate, you pay your way to get there. Most are caught. But like the London bombers, some managed to get up there. Some managed to get in some degraded training camp where most of the mujahideen, whether they're Uzbeks or Chechens or Al-Qaeda, basically says, we don't want you here fighting, which is why they came in the first place. Our people have been fighting for 30 years. They know how to fight. You go home and do something. And they don't even tell them basically what to do. Blow up something. That's basically the message. Go and blow up something. And every single time except for twice, the 7/7 bombing here and 9/11, they have failed. And if you look at the plots, they're almost laughable. Some get lucky. Take the Madrid bombing. Before I get to the Madrid bombing, let me back up just a little bit and make this statement. Although I'm saying that the values that these people are involved with have become sacred values for them, values of the world is unjust. We are basically the driftwood of globalization. The world has left us behind and has created injustice. And look at the Palestinians, look at the Chechens. We can do something about it. Anybody with a paper cutter can cut off the head of Goliath. That's a powerful, heroic, awe-inspiring messages for young people out there who have nothing else to look forward to. Thrilling, adventurous. People tell you, well, let them talk to moderate imams. Let them get the right message of religion. Well, that's going to do nothing at all. First of all, they don't really care about the religion per se. And when did moderation ever stop young people from doing anything? I mean, think about your own kids trying to tell them to be moderate, to change their boyfriends or girlfriends or way of life. It gets you nowhere. You've got to give them sort of thrilling and heroic and adventurous messages. But those who buy into the message of jihad, which is a fairly flat and superficial one, it has to be so that people in Sulawesi or Borneo can plug into it, just like people in South America. If you look at the polls, like Gallup and Pew, it says that about 7% of the 1.3 billion Muslims believe that 9/11 was justified. That's about 100 million Muslims. But if you look at who actually commits to violence, less than 100 in the United States in any serious way, actually less than 60. In all of Europe, less than 2,400 have been arrested. Well, that is a very, very, very small number. So it can't be the ideology that's the main trigger, perhaps among some a necessary but not sufficient condition. So what is the best predictor of whether you'll join the jihad or not? Well, it turns out to be whether your friends do. And especially if you're in an action-oriented group like a soccer team, or you go to camp together, or you raft together, or you play paintball together. If you think I'm not serious, here's an example of the worst case of suicide bombings in the Second Intifada. 2003, December 2003, pretty much ended. 10 kids from the same soccer team, the El Jihad soccer team from the Wad Katila neighborhood, all wanted to go to the local polytechnic, became suicide attackers. Now, were these 10 kids all pathological maniacs? 59 people from Darna, Libya, go to blow themselves up in Iraq. Could there be 59 people suddenly who became pathological maniacs in Darna, Libya? We find again and again, they go with their friends. The last suicide bombing was in February 2008. I went immediately to interview the mother, the brother, the families in the neighborhood of these two guys who blew themselves up in Dimona. The mother had this cell phone with her image of her son talking to her, and she was crying, and she said to me, "He loved those soccer boys so much." And I said, "What?" She said, "The soccer boys, you know, the ones who all died." And he had been waiting 2 years to join them. And the opportunity came. And I'll give you just one more example, and then I'll cool off. First, it's a lot about jihadi cool. It's about flat and fluid networks. There's no real recruitment, there are no cells, there's very little hierarchical command and control. It's mostly self-organized, self-motivating, and self-sustaining. The notion of cells and recruiters is more the bureaucratic imaging of our own intelligence and military groups. Same for the things like the sexual fantasy of their seeking virgins in heavens, which rational choice people love. That's a sexual fantasy of our own society. No group that I ever talked to would accept the martyr looking for virgins. So here's the last example I want to give, and there are lots more in the book. So I went to the Madrid Trial. Now this is an interesting case because headlines across the world said, Al-Qaeda finally does it, changes a democratically elected government. The Popular Party, the Conservative Party, was due to win the election. The Madrid bombings happened. 3 days later, the socialists win. Regime change in a democratic country. They pull out of Iraq. Does Al-Qaeda have anything to do with it? Well, we attended the trial. We translated thousands of pages. We interviewed the family, the friends. Nothing whatsoever. We went and we found that 5 of the 7 Madrid bombers came from this neighborhood in northern Moroccan town of Tetuan, the Jama Mezouak barrio. All lived within 200 meters of one another. Went to the same elementary school, that's it, Abdul Karim, where you have Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Goofy. And they became suicide bombers. They became the ones who changed a democratic regime. They had gone to Madrid. They were a bunch of immigrant kids. They were running drugs. They had nothing to do with ideology, nothing. The ideological guys were schmoozing and playing soccer and wanting to do something for years, but they could never get it together to do anything. Plus, they had police informants who were telling what these kids were doing all the time. But then they hooked up, actually, through a strange set of events. Some guy was in prison with another guy. The police wanted to entrap the guys who were selling dynamite up in northern Spain. They told him to connect with some Moroccans in Madrid. They met at a whorehouse. They decided they were going to sell dynamite to these Moroccans, and that's the way we were going to trap these miners from northern Spain. But the whole thing went haywire, and the dynamite was given for hash in order to blow up the trains in Madrid. But the 5 guys who blew themselves up and came from this neighborhood played soccer together, and that's basically how they came to join one another. And then they met up with the guys who had a message, who didn't know what to do. So the guys who knew how to do something met up with some guys who had a message, but it was the guys who knew how to do something, not the guys with the message, who killed themselves. Now here's a very interesting thing. The old Al-Qaeda was mostly well-educated, married, a plurality of engineers and medical students. The jihad today is much more marginalized. much less educated, much more on the outs of society. And petty criminals are coming into it, not because the jihad looks for criminality, but because once financial transactions were stopped to the Islamic groups funding the jihad, you had to find money some way, and the way to find money and arms and things that you need is with clandestine petty criminal networks. But here's the interesting thing. All economic theory will tell you, people pick criminality for opportunity costs because it pays to be a criminal and it's hard for them to get into the mainstream and become economic actors. But they're the ones who are killing themselves. That makes no sense from an economic perspective. They're sacrificing the totality of their self-interests for a cause, when economic theory is telling you they became criminals in the first place because they obeyed strict cost-benefit logic. Why? Because you're giving them something significant to be, to do in this world. And here's my last message. So I went back to the neighborhood where these suicide bombers came from. And this is true all over the jihad. You know, I've been from the outer islands of Indonesia to North Africa and through Europe. The message is all the same. So I asked the kids in this barrio, who's your hero? Number one, Ronaldinho. That's to be expected. However good Manchester United is or Arsenal, Barca is the class team in the world. Right? They even pay to put on UNICEF shirts, although they've been lately banned in Malaysia because they have crosses on them. Number two, the Terminator. Had no idea it was related to the present governor of California. Number three, Osama bin Laden. Then we went a week after Barack was elected president. He became number three, just ahead of bin Laden. Now remember, this is the neighborhood for the kids who became the suicide bombers, who blew up the trains in Madrid. Their family and friends went to bomb themselves and kill themselves in Iraq. Others are trying to get into Afghanistan. And you ask yourself, what is this telling us? This is telling us that these kids are at a crossroads in life. They're out there flailing around, looking for something significant and a sense of identity, and these are their heroes. And we have no idea how to master or steer them to a message like, yes, we can, versus happiness is martyrdom. People talk about a clash of civilizations. Nothing can be more dead wrong. There is a crash of territorial cultures around the world. Globalization has enabled masses of humanity a better standard of living, access to health, but it has also created a huge driftwood. And young people are unmoored from their millennial traditions. Their parents, none of these suicide terrorists, by the way, in Palestine, none of the parents had any idea what their kids were up to, and every one of them said they would have chained their kids to the heater or chopped off their legs before they let them blow themselves up. They are connecting up with one another. And it's like the old internet cartoon from the New Yorker back in 1993 when there's a dog talking to another dog, typing on the computer, says, no one else knows we're dogs on the internet. Because on the internet, the world you create is the world that is. And the common theme throughout the Takfiri world, this world of the jihad, is young people from a sort of counterculture closing themselves off from other protesters, hunkering down, withdrawing into a parallel universe, psyching themselves up. I mean, we're in Harburg, in the suburb of Hamburg. The neighbors told us, these are the suicide pilots of 9/11. They got an apartment together, they brought in 20 mattresses, they showed videos all day, the place stank, no one ever went out of the place, and they emerged from their cocoon wanting something great. The 9/11 guys, they wanted to go to Bosnia, and the Bosnians said, no, just get us night goggles from Russian surplus that was then inundating Germany. Then they wanted to go to Chechnya, and someone said to them, you know, the Russians aren't going to let you in. And then they met someone on a train, said, maybe I can get you into Pakistan. And they wound up in Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's lap, who basically said, look, boss, who himself had just joined Al-Qaeda with his new proposal to blow up planes that Al-Qaeda, part of Al-Qaeda accepted, and said, hey, boss, look what I got. I got these guys with visas that can get into the United States. That's when the jihad was organized. Now it's much less organized. And in the final analysis, and then by the way, just one message. Obama, he came with such hope after his Cairo speech, and across the world, as I said, he had supplanted Osama bin Laden. but there's been no follow-through. And that's almost worse than having said nothing at all, because now he's dead last among these young people. And I guess the bottom line is, you know, I was in the White House, briefing the White House, National Security Council staff, and one young woman from Mr. Cheney's office said to me, "Don't these young people understand that they've got to take individual responsibility for what they do, and if they don't, we're going to bomb them and kill them because they deserve it?" And I started going, "What? You're going to bomb London? You're going to bomb Madrid? You're going to bomb Morocco, your ally? There's got to be something else you can do." Actually, I brought comic books the next time to the White House. The 99 is an interesting comic book series that has young people hooking up with one another. The 99 are the names of God, and they accumulate power together as they work for things like UNESCO. It's not comic books, you know, comic books these days, or even super action heroes. But it is this notion that there's something significant that speaks to the idealism in these kids, and that they can have opportunities that can be realized that will move them away. And I'll end with this message. During the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln made a speech in which he referred sympathetically to the Southern rebels. An elderly lady, a staunch Unionist, upbraided him for speaking kindly of his enemies when he ought to be thinking of destroying them. His response was classic. "Why, madam," Lincoln answered, "do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" And if you think about war, there are only two ways that wars are truly won. You either exterminate your foe, or you make them your friends. And how to make this future generation our friends, how yes we can trump happiness and martyrdom, is the greatest political challenge we have, without fabricating an enemy, as when Reagan mused to Gorbachev, "If only we had Martians to bring us together," invading Martians. Thanks to the participants in our studies, and thanks to you all for listening.
Thanks. We're just going to talk. I'm going to ask them a few questions for 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll bring the audience in. One of the points about terrorism is the way it's presented, is that it's kind of unquantifiable risk. People are aware there's a risk. There's a lot of rhetoric about risk. There's a lot of sense that it's kind of limitless and unknowable. Now, you say in the book that actually the risk is quite low, but you make one point about the risk, which is the nuke in Manhattan sort of thing, which you mentioned Lashkar al-Taiba could do. Sorry. Can you hear now? So basically you're saying the day-to-day risk we have now is relatively low, but we are subject to all this rhetoric, which builds up the tension. So where do we stand? I mean, how serious is the nuke risk as far as you're concerned? Mm-hmm. And what do we do about the rhetoric of risk?
Okay, there are sort of three parts to the answer. First, the actual risk. Even frequent flyers are more likely to be killed by a lawnmower than they are by a terrorist incident. But there's something way back in the 1920s, I think it was, there was a paper by a Ford analyst for Ford Motor Company called the jerk effect, that says when there's a sudden unexpected event, it resonates much more emotionally than events you expect or are used to, like the occasional lawnmower throwing a piece of glass. And so terrorist events, even single events, black swans if you want, have a much stronger emotional appeal. And it's an irrational one, and it would be the duty of our political leaders and our pundits to put it all in perspective. But they do the opposite. Publicity is the oxygen of terrorism, without which it would die, I think, tomorrow. Never before, I think, in human history have so few people with such few actual means frightened so many. I mean, think about the Cold War. My father was manager of weapons systems development for Westinghouse. He was taken out in the middle of the night and into a secure facility on October 26, 1962, and asked whether Sparrow missiles on Phantom jets could knock down Russian ICBMs over Cuba. And if not, he would have to stay there. Well, he came home visibly shaken. He's a World War II veteran. Never, and I remember it very well, never have we had anything like such a risk. even a nuclear weapon, they could maybe, in their craziest fantasies, do a 1 to 10 kiloton bomb, a fizzle bomb it's called, a gun-type nuclear weapon. The old Al-Qaeda tried and failed miserably. And the new ones, it would be very hard to do. I did this little sort of fast and dirty survey at Qaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad in the physics class, where I asked the physics students, what would it take to make and explode a nuclear bomb in a country that has been persecuting Muslims across the sea? They got themselves into 3 teams. They gave me a complete list of the engineering problems and how long it would take. By the way, I presented this to the Department of Homeland Security, who said it was thoroughly credible. It would take them about 3 years. They would explode it on a park bench. And if in their wildest dreams they were successful, it would wipe out about 11 square city blocks. Terrible thing. But would that destroy our civilization? Yet, the attack on civil liberties that I see, at least in the United States, the militarization of the response almost exceeds that which was the case during the Cold War. It's really crazy that these essentially outliers are holding our civilization hostage, not so much because of what they are and who they are and what they can do, but because of our hysterical reaction to it.
You make the point there about publicity, and you do say in the book we should perhaps step down the publicity on this. Is that possible?
England's doing it. England's much less hysterical than even a couple of years ago. I mean, after the Glasgow attempt, people have basically calmed down a bit. I think there are a number of things working in England's favor, in the UK's favor. First, the experience with the IRA and the fact that there was terrorism, people knew how to react to it. The United States is in a completely different category. They are at a critical moment in their history where their supremacy is being challenged across the world, economic, political supremacy, in a sense feeling somewhat insecure. And the fact that such a niddling, nothing group can cause such havoc and fear demands a great and terminal reaction. And I think that's one of the great reasons that they have reacted so hysterically, and then in our media culture, my God.
Well, I mean, we were talking earlier before this about the difference between the British reactions to bodies coming home and American reactions, which is virtually, as far as I understood what you said, censored. And the fact that the Americans welcomed Obama's troop surge as the greatest thing he'd done.
Most popular thing Obama has done, yeah, among his own people and among others.
Why is this? I mean, is this because of the polarization of American politics in the media?
Because you're hitting them back. I mean, revenge is a big part of it, and also the show that you are doing something. I mean, what are you going to do? When I talk about heroes, they look at me like I'm planning fruitcake. I mean, it's a long-term thing. Another thing that figures into it, what determines foreign policy is exclusively the National Security Council. Congress has no role except when things go south. Now, the National Security Council of the United States is made up uniquely of the intelligence services, the military, the Council of Economic Advisors, and of course, chief cabinet officers. There's nothing about health, welfare, completely different in the United States. The United States is an immigrant country. Its social fabric is made for the absorption of immigrants and the realization of what they call the American dream, and Muslims almost unanimously buy into it. There is really no threat within the United States. It's very, very small. But our foreign policy and the way the social fabric of the United States is built are at complete odds with respect to these young people. And so the only tools we have, other than USAID, which is a very short budget period of 3 years, which you can accomplish virtually nothing, is you have to hammer them, you have to bomb them in their lairs, you have to criminalize them, and that's the only way you'll really stop them.
One final point, before I bring in the audience. You're talking about small group dynamics being the important point here. Now, that's a very fine-grained target and very difficult to track. So although one can agree with the generalities, it's very difficult to know what specific goals one can set oneself.
Yes. You know, I go to so many meetings, say Defense Department meetings or security meetings, and there's billions of dollars spent for widgets, for models and parameterization and predictability and mathematization of what the jihadis are going to do. But it's an almost random process, as you intimate. It's like boiling water. You don't know which cones are going to first come to the surface and boil. It's almost impossible to predict. You know that things will boil eventually and that some cones will rise up, but you never know where. And so you can't control at that level, but you can stop the water from boiling. You can change the basic political setup and the way you interact with the world, and that's, in the end, the only way you're going to stop it.
So just one final point, really. The point you make about religion, it seems to me, is very important because you're an atheist yourself, but you're very sympathetic to the idea of religion. You don't regard it as sort of simply a belief system. It's also a question of belonging. It's a question of providing causes, if necessary, but often they're good causes. And in a sense, you seem to think the militant atheists of Richard Dawkins and so on are doing more harm than good with this.
Well, let me say I'm an atheist only in terms of I don't believe in an anthropomorphized supernatural deity. But as I sort of hinted here, I do believe that it's transcendent or sacred values that have got us out of the caves and are responsible for all the great and evil things that human beings have done. Human rights, for example, is a very religious notion. Take life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which in the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of the Rights of Man is considered given by providence or natural and inalienable rights. Nothing can be more unnatural than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you look at the history of our species, okay, cannibalism, slavery, suppression of women, that went on for about 200,000 years. Human rights for about 150 years max in a few places. So nothing is less natural than that. It was engineering, social engineering of a magnificent sort, motivated by crackpot belief in transcendental ideals. Yeah. So that, in fact, I believe in, and I have a very strong religious sentiment in that sense. That's what you have to play to, I think, to move these young people away. And I should mention one last thing. The only ones that I've seen, once people make the commitment, the jump, I'm talking about when heroes, before they get to the level of, I'm going to go blow up myself. But even once they get to that level, nothing we do can do anything. But the Salafis can. The only ones who I've ever seen able to pull back people who have committed to suicide bombings are Salafis, who say, we believe the same thing, but you're doing it the wrong way. There is a peaceable way to spread the message of Islam. Whether you agree with that or not, they can get them away. The only guys who are going to get white supremacists to pull away are Christian fundamentalists. So we have to play the whole span of opportunities we have. And it will be different in different places, at different levels of commitment, and with different groups of people. To make blanket statements like religion is evil, I mean, that's really crazy.